Hello and welcome to a different type of video from me. This is specifically to do with the procurement cycle coming through level 4. And I noticed with level 4 module 8 that pretty much the whole book is looking at the procurement cycle. So you could get a question about any stage in that cycle in the L4M8 book or exam. But what I think is important is that you understand the sort of theory that you could bring into a question at different stages of the procurement cycle. So I hope you find this helpful. So at stage 1, this is about understanding the need. And what we know, of course, is that without a clear understanding of a business need, the cycle can get off to a really bad start. So the process here is to understand and define what our business needs are. By involving cross-functional stakeholders in that process and utilising their expertise, you can develop sort of, high-level specs at this stage and engage stakeholders very early on to make sure you understand what their requirements are. So some of the models and theories that I think you should build into an answer if you're responding about understanding the need stage is RACSI, which is sort of reconciling your business needs back to either a regulatory reason, assurance of supply, quality, cost, service, or innovation. The RACI model and the Mendelow's matrix are around stakeholders. So RACI looks at sort of who's responsible, accountable, who you consult and who you inform, whereas Mendelow's will look at which stakeholders have got power and interest so you can manage them better. But also at stage 1, in terms of understanding the need, you need to know whether or not you're buying something that you've bought before. Is that a straight rebuy? Is it a modified rebuy or a new buy? Because that will dictate which of the following steps you then skip, or if it's a completely new buy, you'd potentially look at all of those steps. And then very high level, whether or not while you're understanding that need, it should be specified as a conformance or a performance. So this will be the start of your business case development. Your business requirements documents will start to form from stage 1. So moving on to stage 2, this is about your market and commodity options. There are lots of tools that can help you in understanding the market and commodity that you're buying. So you might be looking at things like, make buy decisions, whether to outsource a service, scoping out your spend and your position and what the dynamics are like in the marketplace. So the theories here is the micro ones, looking at Porter's 5 forces, whether the buyer or supplier has the power, whether or not there's a threat of a new entrant or a substitute. And the generic strategies around sort of differentiation or cost focus or leadership. SWOT has a mixture of internal and external. You've got strengths and weaknesses that are internal, opportunities and threats that are external. But the steeple analysis is all external factors from social, technological, economic, environment, political, legal, and ethical. What does the supply and demand look like? Is there more buyers than suppliers or vice versa? Ansoff matrix is another good one that you could look at. This is categorizing the organization strategy for growth. The outsourcing matrix or make buy decisions, whether you should offshore, and also supplier segmentation, looking at the sort of collaborative transactional relationships. So at stage 3, you'll be developing your strategy and plan, and poor planning leads to poor performance. So once you've developed the spec and outlined what your business requirements are and assessed the marketplace, the next stage is to develop the strategy and plan that could be considered the potential impact on the external environment. So it may be that an organisational policy is used for small local suppliers, or it may be about a global source. So first thing you need to obviously look at is your company's organisational strategy. What's their vision? And then what's your supply chain strategy? Is it about buying locally, buying globally? And that will trickle down into individual KPIs for different categories potentially. But also when you're developing your plan and strategy, you should be looking at your Gantt charts and project plans so you can start to map out what needs to be done by who and by when. And securing the budget and planning for that. And at this point as well, the amount of time and effort you give to developing a strategy and plan will depend on the importance of, the product or service to your organisation. So using Pareto at this point helps you to kind of prioritise using an 80-20 rule. So stage 4, market engagement and testing. So we now need to stimulate the supply market. And this identifies both stakeholders and business needs and the changes required to implement your procurement strategy. So testing the market or strategy is going to help us to see if it's the right time to go to the marketplace or not. What's your competitors doing? Are there any new legislations that are coming in? So you should monitor that on an ongoing basis. But some of the tools and theories you can build into this kind of answer is around early supplier involvement, the benefits and risks of doing so. Maybe thinking about how cost is made up of, do a purchase price cost analysis of the market. And you can look at some of those things through, suppliers' profit and loss accounts, see what their direct and indirect costs are. Do a bit of primary and secondary data analysis, primary being asking firsthand the answer to a question that you want to know the answer for, whereas secondary one might just be looking at information that's already been published. And the data itself can be qualitative or quantitative. The qualitative stuff is more opinions-based, and quantitative is data like the size of the market, the prices, the trends. And then lastly, a little bit of benchmarking, finding out what your competitors are doing and what the market's doing. So stage 5 looks at developing documentation, and the time you spend in developing documents obviously depends on the size of the contract. So if it's something really simple, like a quick quote, you're not going to spend too much time developing documents, but for a multi-yeared, large-scale £1 million tender, you would have far more documents to develop because of the risks associated with those larger contracts. So, the first bit around developing docs, make sure you pick the right template, whether it's a tender, a quote, a proposal, or a request for information. And the documents that you'd want to think about including are the spec, whether that's conformance or performance, the terms and conditions, the T's, the C's, the PQQs, sort of looking at suppliers' suitability. Method statements, in service-based contracts, you might ask the supplier to detail the method of how they're going to work for you. And lastly, things like the pricing schedule that you want them to complete, and the site lists of where the service or goods need to be delivered. So moving on to stage 6, now we're at the supplier selection stage, and here information is ammunition. So conducting RFIs at this stage in the cycle can really help you to gain insights into suppliers' sizes, capabilities, finances, strengths and weaknesses. And you do all of this before deciding whether or not you should include them in the tender process. So a lot of this is about the bidder, not the bid itself. You're kind of pre-qualifying people. And ranking some of these performance qualifiers against the business needs can help you to kind of make sure that, what's more important to you? Is it their experience in a certain area that's vital and important? Give that a higher weighting than their financials, for example. So some of the things and theories you can put in here is the Carter's 10 C's, which look at things like capacity, cost, capability, culture, communications, clean, control. There's quite a few of them. Look them up if you're not sure. And the DADS face-to-face is an alternative to Carter's 10 C's, but it's roughly the same thing. Public sector sometimes use pre-qual questionnaires or SSQs, which is a standard selection questionnaire. You can do a bit of financial ratios, look at things like liquidity, profit and loss, gearing, or do a full accounts review, even leaning on a third-party credit reference agency. But also consider things like the ethical criteria here, sustainability, CSR, and the cultural web. What's the culture like between your organisation and their organisation? Are you compatible? So stage 7 is now looking at the issuing of a tender or a quote. So we now move on to sort of the offer and acceptance. Once you've sort of selected the companies to participate a formal tender or request for quote, you send that out to those participants to include all of the documents we spoke about already, from the spec to the terms, and you give them a clear timescale to respond. So it should be noted that these documents would include the standard terms and conditions, because what you want is from suppliers to kind of come back and say whether or not they want to I don't know, qualify or change anything that you've asked them to do. They might say, actually, term number 3 is not really something that I can agree to. Could you overlook that? And that's a decision you can make during the live tender or quote period. So I think at this point, what you might want to say in an exam question about tenders and quotes is that there is quite a lot of difference between the public and private sector in terms of the formalities and rules around issuing documentation. Obviously, public sector is far more legislated than the public sector. Sorry, the public sector is far more legislated than the private sector. And the different procedures could be open, restricted, competitive dialogue, competitive procedure with negotiation, innovation partnerships. And even here, you might want to talk about the use of technology. So you could talk about sort of e-sourcing portals. So going on to stage 8, the bid and tender evaluation, the offers made by potential suppliers must be compared against the initial need. And, once the tenders are submitted, bids have been made, an offer is being made, which as a buyer, you can accept or not, or reject, as the case may be. But these bids must be evaluated and validated in order to be able for, you to select the right supplier. So in this stage, I would expect you to be bringing in a little bit about MEET criteria, which stands for the most economically advantageous tender, which is very common in the public sector. It just basically means you're not awarding to the cheapest price. You've got a sort of balanced supplier scorecard with higher weighting given to certain factors. Think about your evaluation methodology as well. What does good look like to you? So you might score, for example, on a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 basis, where 1 is rubbish and 5 is brilliant. And then that kind of enables you to pre-warn suppliers exactly how you're going to evaluate it, and you stick to that promise. At this point as well, when the tenders are back, you might actually, in the private sector, you might want to negotiate with them and say, well, thanks very much for your offer, but actually I want to negotiate on this factor or that factor. So think about the negotiation tactics you can put in here, like good cop, bad cop. You could have, salami, shotgun. There's loads of kind of tactics in the book that you could look at. And absolutely, you must set your targets of what you must intend and like when it comes to negotiation. And then once you finalise that, you should have a very clear idea about who you want to award the contract to, which brings us into stage 9. So once supply has been successful, a legally binding contract is typically developed, which will allow both parties to fully understand their obligations and key success criteria. This forms the foundation to manage the contract and the relationship effectively. The agreed terms and conditions help to minimise any risk and exposure when doing business. So if you're answering a question around stage 9, I would expect you to understand the things that constitute a legally binding contract, being the offer, acceptance, consideration, intention, and capacity. I'd expect you to talk about expressed versus implied terms and conditions and warranties. The breaches, damages, and termination rights of each party, and the importance of a document signature, because if people haven't signed the contract, it's sometimes difficult to actually enforce it. Again, the importance of thinking about mobilisation and transition. If you're bringing in a new supplier that you've never worked with before, you will need a period of mobilisation. And if you're moving from supplier A to supplier B, there is a transition requirement too. And in that sort of situation, I would expect you to talk about the Cotter's 8-step change process as well, because change is not easy, so it needs to be managed appropriately. So moving on to stage 10, we're now at warehousing and logistics, and delivery of the goods is not the end of the cycle, trust me. Procurement and supply go hand in hand, and the job of procurement is to procure the right goods, right quality, and deliver them to the right place. So the 5 rights are definitely a key theory I would expect you to build in if you're talking about stage 10. So the buying organisation has a duty of care regarding the state of the goods being stored and delivered. The warehouse operators need to consider product coding, classification, space, layout, racking, frequency of deliveries, order processing, booking in procedures. And it's all about, ensuring you've got an efficient process. So other theories you could put in here other than the 5 rights is the EOQ, the economic order quantity, Porter's value chain, inputs, transformation, outputs, the use of barcodes and radio frequency ID, different types of material handling equipment like forklift trucks, pallet trucks, conveyor belts, the importance and role that packaging and pack-in plays in making sure that the goods being stored remain safe. Automation, maybe think about, the use of robots and technology to help the warehouse run a little bit more efficiently. You could talk about the technology being MRP, just in time, or Kanban. And then forecasting, the difference between objective and subjective forecasting might be a good one to talk about here as well. So moving on to stage 11, we're now at contract performance. Performance must be mapped against the responsibilities that are set out in the contract. There should be a periodic review of performance against the KPIs. And that discussion should also be on how the relationship is working to try and resolve any conflict that might have arisen. And at this stage, discussions and plans can be set for continuous improvement along with the next review date. And it should be an ongoing activity. So some of the sort of tools and theories you can build in here is site visits, total quality management, Six Sigma, which is all about sort of zero defects, ISO 9000, the risk management approach, sort of thinking about what risks might happen, what's the likelihood versus the impact, and the 4 T's being the sort of tolerate, treat, terminate, transfer. That's how you sort of deal with a risk. Service level improvements and KPIs, and in some instances, if it's like a service-based contract, you might be managing them by objectives that you want them to achieve, but definitely build in those reviews so you can seek continuous improvement through the contract. Moving on to stage 12. So now we're looking at supplier relationship management and supply chain management. So supplier relationship management is a really important part of supply chain management, because what it does is it helps you to review the portfolio of suppliers and arrange your resources so that you can devote the right level of input into a relationship to achieve that specific objective. But how much time you devote obviously depends on your strategy, your type of purchase, the length of the contract. So you need to create the right relationship in the right environment. And this again is an ongoing activity. But some of the tools you can put into the answer of a question about stage 12 will be CrowdCheck, the relationship spectrum, supplier preferencing, and the market management matrix, which combines the kind of CrowdCheck and supplier preferencing together and shows you whether or not your relationship is compatible. And if it's not compatible, what you can do to change that. Also consider the relationship life cycle. If you've been in a contract with a supplier for many years, it will eventually hit maturity and decline, and you may need to make a renewed effort, if you like, to spend more time with the supplier and get that relationship back on a kind of new agenda, so you start to go through the second iteration. And you can also use Mendelow's again in here to understand the stakeholders involved at the back end, including that supply chain mapping, which is really important for sort of multi-tiered supply chains where you're dealing with tier 1, but there's maybe a tier 2, tier 3, or even a tier 4 beneath them. And then the final stage is asset management, stage 13. But it should be noted that asset management will only apply if the procurement represents an asset to the organisation. Where goods are used or moved on through the network, they will not form an asset. Services are intangible and cannot be owned, so again, they're not an asset. So the sorts of things I'd expect you to talk about at stage 13 is whole life costing, not focusing not just on the purchase price, but all the costs that you will have to pay to own this asset for the period of time. Think about commissioning, which includes training, installation, connecting up to water, electricity, gas, even internet connectivity. and the decommissioning, which will include reversing everything I just said, but also cleaning and the disposal of any chemicals or whatever that's in the asset. You need to make sure it's being disposed of in environmentally friendly, in accordance with environmentally friendly legislation. But during the life of the asset, you will need to think about maintaining it, and from an accounting perspective, depreciating the value of that asset over time. Another thing you can build in at stage 13 is the decision whether to buy something or lease it, and the benefits and drawbacks to doing that. And you could also include a bit of Belbin team roles and understand who plays what role at what time, and the Tuckman's model. But also, lastly, the waste hierarchy. There's the sort of reduce, reuse, recycle, repair, recover, but definitely not putting it into landfill, just trying to have a more closed loop supply chain. So I hope you found that helpful. That's literally just a really super quick look at the theory behind each stage of the procurement cycle. And I'd say it's more relevant to kind of module 8, but it's helpful to some of the others because you'll see nuggets of things like module 3 looking at the contracts bit, module 6 looking at the relationships, module 7 looking at the assets. So it's and of course the warehousing and logistics. So different parts of that will crop up across all of the modules, but module 8 tends to be asking you to know the whole cycle. So hopefully that's helpful. Don't forget to include your theory. Don't forget to include a definition in your answer, and make sure you answer the question in the right context. Good luck. Thanks for watching.